tonight what the Bible says about racism. You know, we're starting out here tonight in Nikkei Park, in Nikkei Memorial in a park in Steveston in Richmond, British Columbia. And behind me here is this stone. This is the Steveston Nikkei Memorial. And here at this stone, it was erected just in 2019, just a few months ago. I think it was July of 2019. And this stone is a commemoration. You know, in 1942, on March the 4th, there were orders given in British Columbia. And on that day, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were rounded up and they were sent to Hastings Park in downtown Vancouver. And then from there, they were sent to a number of areas in British Columbia and across further into the Rockies and across east of the Rockies and onto farms in Alberta. And the reason these Japanese Canadians were sent there was because in 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, in December of 1941, there were concerns in Canada that the Japanese, people of Japanese nationality would somehow side with the Japanese government and then provide intelligence and provide boots on the ground here for some kind of insurrection. And so they made a decree that all of the Japanese Canadians needed to be moved out. And right here, this memorial tells us that 2,000 people from Richmond here in Steveston were actually part of that group that was sent to areas across BC, New Denver, Slocan, and a number of other settlements. So they were singled out because of their race. They were singled out because of their race. What I find truly ironic in that situation was because the war, World War II, started in 1939, and there were also people of German and Italian descent living in Vancouver. But you know, I find intriguing that those individuals, although they had a similar decree made about them, they weren't actually moved. Only 500 Italians were actually interned in camps in British Columbia and across the prairies. Only 500. But the Japanese were singled out. And I chose this location as a starting place for our discussion tonight because it's one of these memorials that we have made to remind ourselves of the cost of racism. That when we single out a particular group based on their racial origin, that we are committing discrimination. You know, it was in 1942 that these things happened. But in 1945, when the war was over, these laws were still enacted. 1947, they were still being enforced. And it wasn't until 1949, a full 4 years after the war was finished, after World War II was done, that the Canadian government actually allowed Japanese Canadians to return back to the places that they had come from here in Richmond and in other places. But of course, all of their property had been confiscated. And so it was one of these examples, a dark mark in Canadian history, and it was a racist act. You know, in 1989, the Canadian Prime Minister gave an apology for this. So we have racism right here, systemic, and it's among us, and it's here. It's not something that's far away. It's actually something that we all face. And all of us are forced to confront these kinds of biases. You know, what actually is racism? Here's a definition. Racism is the belief that a particular race is superior to another, and that a person's social and moral traits are predetermined by his or her inborn biological characteristics. So imagine having an assessment done upon you because of the way that you were born. And because of the way that you were born, which is something that none of us can change, there was a prejudice and there was discrimination because of the way that they were born. Now, we all know that there are multiple ways to divide humanity. You know, the world can be divided up economically, the haves and the have-nots. And the world can be divided up by nationality. And I know that every 4 years, well, it won't be this year, but every 4 years when the Olympics happen, we all stand behind our flag and we cheer, but we know it's just a game, and we hope no one gets hurt, and that's just the way it goes. And the world can be divided up into culture. Certain individuals have a cultural preference, a cultural choice, or a culture that they were brought up in that they adhere to, and so the world can be divided on that. The world can be divided on religion. What's your value system when it comes to God and the universe and eternity and the afterlife? And so the world can be divided up a number of ways. But you heard it here first. Let me make a prediction. By next year, we're going to have another division present in the world that really we don't have right now. And you know what it is? It's a division that's called vaccine nationalism. Now, what's going to happen over the next couple of months with COVID is they're working hard on a vaccine, and nations are working to develop a vaccine because it is their hope, still unproven, but it is their hope that a vaccine will enable a population to mingle and get back to work. And the country that comes up with the first effective vaccine will actually have an economic advantage over their neighbor. And so the question comes down to this: if we develop a vaccine, who's the first to get it? And we're going to see a divide, and it's going to be vaccine nationalism. It's going to be a new way to divide the world. So really the question becomes, when we look at this book, and we understand clearly the problems of racism, we're seeing it all around in the unrest and everything in the world today, but when it comes to this book, what does the Bible say? What are the thoughts that it has? What's the approach that it takes to actually help us solve the problem? There are all kinds of people who are going to make certain suggestions about how to solve this problem. And I'm not going to get into those because that's not our goal. But let me just make mention of one of them. Here's a statement, a quote by Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman says, "How do we stop racism? Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man." And that's a great suggestion to move forward with. But it doesn't do anything about the past. It doesn't fix the past. And so what we want to discover tonight is that the Bible's approach to this problem is something that not only prepares us for the future, much like the statement that Morgan Freeman made, but it can also take care of the crimes of the past. And it is something that is whole. It is something that is holistic. It is something that is healing. And it is something that is saving. So the question becomes, what does the Bible say about racism? Now, why do I think that the Bible has a solution? Because, this book has been around for a long time, and people might say, well, Kyle, the book's been around. It obviously doesn't have a lot to say about it, because if we look at the world we live in, hey, it doesn't work. But to that, I'll just say this, that the Bible provides a remedy. It provides a theological and a psychological and a philosophical foundation on how to treat everyone equal and why we actually are all equal. And it's a medicine. But if you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you a prescription and you take that prescription home and you put it on the medicine shelf in your bathroom, and then you don't end up taking the medicine, well, you can say all you want that the medicine is the cure, but unless you actually take it and embrace it, you're not going to get very far. You're not going to make any improvements. So in order to evaluate the solution, we have to ask ourselves, if we embraced the ideas promoted and taught in the Bible, what kind of a world would that produce? What world would it produce? So that's really what I mean when I say, why do I think the Bible has a solution? Because if we took its ideas and we actually applied them, we would discover that there would be a solution. Now, the Bible usually approaches problems in two different ways. One of the ways that the Bible approaches a problem is it tells a story about it. It tells a story, gives you a little bit of background, gives you a little bit of an idea of how things operate in the real world and how things can be dealt with by real world example. But the other way that it deals with things is that it actually talks directly about the subject and gives direct theological or academic or intellectual reasons as to why it is the way it is. So we got a two-pronged approach. Number one, the actions of some of the actors in the Bible, the stories, and secondly, we have the ideas that are presented clearly and plainly. So let's take a look at some of the stories that are presented. Now, keep in mind that when we approach the problem of racism, and we do so in 2020, we're approaching this problem with a whole lot of different sensitivities than other people in other times may have had. And so because of the internet and because of communication and because of the widespread research and knowledge that has been shared about this, we, I think, are hopefully becoming more and more sensitive. I don't think we've arrived. I look at myself. I don't think I've arrived. I think there's a lot of self-examination that still needs to take place, and we still need to improve on this. But keep in mind that when the Bible was written, these ideas are ideas that had never been presented before. People weren't thinking this way, and when Jesus came along, he astounded people by the things that he taught and by the actions that he took. So here's one example. In John chapter 4, and you can read about this if you go to the Gospel of John chapter 4, there was a lady there, and she was in the city of Samaria. And the Samaritans have no dealings with the people from Jerusalem and from other parts of Israel. It's actually stated that in the Bible. There was a racial divide. One group claimed a certain lineage, the other group claimed a different lineage, and the two didn't really mix and meet. And so here in this story in John 4, Jesus and his 12 disciples come along, and they go to this place called Samaria. And in that city, Jesus sits at a well, and his 12 disciples leave and they go into the town. And Jesus talks to a lady at the well. He meets her, he introduces himself, and she wonders why he is speaking to her, because she knows that the Jews and the Samaritans don't really mix. So why is it? So Jesus broke a racial barrier when he did that. Now, at the end of that story, what I find amazing is that woman became a far, far better disciple and evangelist than those 12 men that Jesus had with him. Because those 12 men left Jesus and went into the city, and they came out empty-handed, except for some food. But the lady who Jesus talked to, and by breaking down those racial barriers, presented to her truth about himself, and she embraced him as the Christ and as the Messiah and as the Savior of the world. And what she did was she went back into the town, she spoke to those she knew, and a whole pile of people became followers of Jesus. So her testimony, her example, her preaching, I guess if you call it that, was way more effective than these 12 men that were there. So Jesus broke a racial barrier at the well in Samaria. You know, Jesus broke a racial barrier in Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus was dealing with a Roman centurion. And there the people that Jesus was among, they hated the Roman occupiers, couldn't stand them. But Jesus actually goes and heals this centurion's servant. And in that interaction, Jesus shows a respect, and he shows a love and a care and a kindness for the Roman occupier of the nation. And this would have been groundbreaking at the time, but Jesus breaks down the racial barrier, and he does so by an act of kindness. There is another lady in Matthew 15, she's called a Canaanite woman, and she's not actually a Jewish person. And so all of the people around Jesus would have just despised her, but Jesus actually goes and talks to her, and he meets her need and he helps her. There's a story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. And in that story, we have this idea that a Jewish person traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, he falls among thieves, he gets beaten up, and he's left half dead in the ditch. And the person who helps him is a Samaritan. Again, somebody who would have had no dealings with him otherwise. But Jesus, by these stories, is demonstrating that he is breaking down these racial divides, and they are silly to create walls based on this fact. And so he breaks down the racial divide. Did you know that the day that Jesus was crucified, back there in just outside the city of Jerusalem, probably in the year AD 31, the month of April, but there, on that occasion, the man who carried the cross for Jesus, you know, remember Jesus was beaten up, he was bloodied, he was bruised, and he was weakened, in a weakened state. And they got a man, Simon, the Cyrenian. Now, Cyrene is from North Africa. And so even in that, the Romans thought, well, let's get this newcomer to town, and he can do the work of a slave. But Jesus passes his cross over. And here I find it amazing that that man and his name and his descent and his race, they make it into the Bible. And this book is the most amazing book. It's the most popular book ever printed. It sold more copies. It's the best-selling book of all. And there, Simon's name is on the pages in 2 of the books, 2 of the chapters in this Bible. So we have Jesus and his treatment of others. You know, when the church came into existence, and you can read about that in the book of Acts chapter 2, when the church came into existence, we discover that there were people from a whole pile of different nations, from Cyprus and from Africa and from the Middle East and from the area Samaria and around Jerusalem. And at the very beginning, the very first day the church got together, there were people from every possible country in that region, and they were there. And it's a demonstration to us, the example to us, that when individuals commit their lives to Christ and believe on Jesus Christ, and when they become Christians, that identifier takes over. And all of the other barriers need to fall away, because none of them are as important as this one, being a follower of Christ. Now, if you come to Carleton Gospel Hall when we're allowed to, and that might not be for a while, but if you were to visit us, I can't judge whether or not, I hope we're not a racist group. I don't think we are. And if we are, you know, point it out to me and point it out to others, and let's fix that. But I will tell you this, that you will be welcomed in Arabic, you'll be welcomed in Spanish, in French, in Portuguese, in Chokwe, in Chinese, in Korean, and in English, and we even understand Americans and their twang too. All of those individuals are represented in our church, and I like to think it's a little example, a little piece of heaven. And so the Bible tells us that through these stories, that there is a unity that comes about because of people's belief in Jesus Christ. So that's the story side of things. But let's talk a little bit about the theology side, the intellectual side, the academic side, the teaching side, the doctrine of it. Here's a quote from the book of Acts chapter 17. Now this preacher, his name was Paul. He's in the city of Athens, which is a pretty, cosmopolitan place, a pretty multicultural city comparatively. And when Paul speaks, he says this, that God has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. And in that section, he's clearly teaching that underneath this skin that might be a different color, there is a humanity that is common. And the phrase that he uses here is one blood. You know, we all bleed the same color. Unless, of course, we have raised or lowered oxygen levels, and then our blood might change a little. But on the outside, we might see a difference. But on the inside, we are one blood. There is only one human race. There is not a variety. When we come to the book of Romans chapter 3, there we discover a simple statement talking about what we might consider the racial divide. And here's what the Bible says about all of humanity. It takes every human, puts them on exactly the same level, and says this. Romans chapter 3, there is no difference, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There is not one kind of person who is born closer to God than anyone else. That's a figment of your imagination if you think that. We are all sinners. There's another phrase in the book of Ephesians chapter 2, and it says this, that when individuals become Christians, they are made one new person. And before, there might have been people from all kinds of walks of life, all kinds of cultures, all kinds of languages. But then what does the gospel do? What it does is it breaks down all of those divisions, and it unites people, now not based on their color, and now not based on their physical attributes or their mental attributes or their intelligence and IQ and EQ and all that stuff. It unites them on the basis of this, that individuals come to Jesus Christ, acknowledge what he did on the cross was for them, that when he died, he was dying for sinners, and when they accept that and believe that, they are born again, they become part of a new family, and in this new family, they are a new entity altogether. And so all of the old divisions drop away. It's expressed this way in Galatians chapter 3. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So the belief in the gospel brings people together, and all of the divisions fall away. Now, When we talk about all of these divisions falling away, and I just want to address just something briefly here about our current situation, not only in Canada, but especially in the United States and around the world. And it's the subject that Black Lives Matter. Now, some people would say, well, all lives matter. Well, that's true, but it kind of misses the point. I think Jesus actually was the start. He actually taught about this concept, Black Lives Matter. He did. Now hear me through. Jesus told a story in Luke chapter 15 about a farmer who had 100 sheep. And of those 100 sheep, the Bible tells us in that story that Jesus said, he had 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray. One of the sheep was missing. And what the farmer did was he left the 99 that were already safe, and they were in the fold and they were on the farm and they were okay. And he went out into the area, probably into the mountains or the hills, despite the weather, despite all of the threats of carnivores or predators. And what he did was he went and he found the one. And it was the one that was in danger, and it was the one that needed help. And so we could actually say about that farmer and his sheep that one sheep matters. It did. Are we saying that the other 99 didn't matter? No, we're not. Of course they mattered, but they weren't the ones in particular danger at that point in time. And so we have this concept that Jesus taught, that singling out those who were vulnerable, those who were in danger, and rescuing them was the right thing to do. And so I have no problem at all. It's not a political statement. I'm not taking any kind of sides in this debate, but I can truthfully say, full stop, Black Lives Matter. So this solution that we've talked about, the examples we've given from the Bible, and then the direct teaching that we've got from the New Testament about the equality of all humanity. Does the solution work? Well, to me, I think of the abolition of slavery. It was brought about, I guess, in the late 1700s, the work of a man called William Wilberforce, the work of a woman called Hannah More, and together they tackled this tremendous problem of slavery. And finally, right near the end of his life, William Wilberforce was able to see the law passed that abolished slavery. But you know what motivated him? He was motivated by a fear of God, because he believed that he had to answer to God, and he urged everyone in authority and leadership in England at the time that they would have to answer to God for how they treated a fellow human being. And based on that motivation, that there was a God to whom everyone is accountable, it brought about the greatest form of legislative equality that the world has ever seen. And so these ideas do work. I'm just going to finish by telling you a story. And here we are, we're at the Steveston Nikkei Memorial. It's about Japanese Canadians, but let's talk about this for a minute. Pearl Harbor, 1941, December the 7th. There was a pilot, a Japanese pilot that day, and that Japanese pilot, he came off of the aircraft carriers, he led the group of airplanes into Pearl Harbor, and as they were coming into Pearl Harbor, he keyed into the mic those three famous words, Tora, Tora, Tora. And that was the commencement of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now that man was Captain Fuchito. Captain Fuchito. So keep that in mind. A few months later, the Americans launched an attack from an aircraft carrier on the city of Tokyo. This was called the Doolittle Raid. One of the pilots on board, one of the B-25s, the airplane that attacked, he was a man called Jacob DeShazer. And DeShazer's aircraft took off from the aircraft carrier. They went in over Japan, they bombed, and he was taken prisoner after his airplane crash landed. And he spent the rest of the war in prison, hating his Japanese captors. And the way that he worded it, he wanted to survive so that after all of this was done, he would be able to come back to Japan and kill as many Japanese people as he could. But you know what happened to Mr. DeShazer when he was there? And afterwards, when he got back to America, it changed his life. He found a verse in this book, and it was a verse that quoted Jesus on the cross when Jesus looked down at the nations and the people who were there represented at the cross, and he said this, looking to heaven, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They don't know what they're doing. And Mr. DeShazer was so struck by this, the bitterness in his heart that he held for another human being and the anger that he had. He wanted to accept this truth, and his anger melted away. He became a Christian when he realized that God forgave him because even Jacob DeShazer didn't know what he was doing. And Jacob DeShazer became a missionary, and he went to Japan, now not to kill people, but to actually give them the same message that transformed his heart and his life. He wrote many gospel papers and little pieces of paper, pamphlets. He wrote them and he distributed them. And one day one of those pamphlets was on the sidewalk. And there was a gentleman there, he was down and out. And he saw this piece of paper in the sidewalk and he picked it up and he read it. And he read these words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Of course, they were in Japanese. And that man gave up his anger, trusted God, believed in Jesus Christ, and he was converted. And do you know who that man was? That Japanese man was the captain who had keyed in the words "Torah, Torah, Torah" on the attack on Pearl Harbor. Those two men subsequently met after the war. If you go to Hawaii, once COVID is over, but if you go to Hawaii, you can actually go and find a stone, a memorial, much like this one, that those two people set up, and they shook hands. They were now united, not divided by race and divided by hate, but now united in Christ. And you know what it says on that rock? Inscribed on the words of on that rock are the words of the Gospel of Luke, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." So I want to tell you this, that the medicine of the Bible, when it comes to this whole subject of racism and division, it works. It's true. It's reliable. And if it is implemented, it will rid the world of all its problems. But how would it be implemented? It's going to be implemented this way. Not by any legislation, not by any religious decree, not by some guy standing up and saying you all have to think this way, but it will only be done and it will only change one person at a time. When an individual realizes that they are nothing in front of God, confront who you are. Confront the fact that you are a sinner. You know what's difficult? It was difficult confronting the fact that I might be a racist. It was difficult considering that maybe I've got views and I've got habits that are systemic or that are hurtful in any way. My viewpoints or my actions, and I have to examine them. You know what? That's hard to do. But if you were to take that same attitude to your position as who you are in front of God, just a sinner that needs to be rescued and saved, then an individual who understands that I am nothing in front of a holy God, but God gave His Son Jesus Christ on the cross, and Christ died on the cross to pay the penalty for sin that I could never pay. And He can transform me and change me because I can be born again and welcomed into the family of God. And now, not just like Morgan Freeman's idea that in the future I could live a certain way and I could refer to people differently. That would help with the future. But my past is forgiven. My past is forgiven because there was a man who went to a cross and he said, "Forgive, for they know not what they do." And when I embraced what Jesus taught at the cross, I became a Christian. I was relieved from the burden of my sin. I was saved and I was rescued. So, we're going to leave you with this. Number one, you need to be reconciled to God. And then secondly, you will find yourself aligned with other human beings and you can live in humility and truthfulness. God bless you. Hopefully we'll be here again next Sunday night at 6 p.m. We'll take up another subject. But we welcome you back again and we want to thank you for listening tonight. Good night.